before Kara Zor-El. There was a test run. To understand the creation of the first Supergirl, you have to look at the landscape of the late 1950s comic book industry. The post-war superhero boom had long since flattened out. The introduction of the Comics Code Authority in 1954 had systematically sanitized the medium, leaving publishers desperate for new ways to move inventory. DC Comics was sitting on Superman, a highly lucrative, aggressively protected intellectual property. They realized that girls, statistically speaking, possessed disposable allowance money. But capturing that market meant taking a terrifying risk, diluting the singular, lonely god mythos of the Man of Steel by giving him a surviving female equal. So rather than commit, DC engineered a loophole. In August 1958, within the pages of Superman number 123, they executed what might be the most cynical piece of corporate A/B testing in pop culture history. Intrepid cub reporter Jimmy Olsen manages to acquire an ancient Native American magic totem. Because in mid-century editorial meetings, indigenous artifacts were simply the standard narrative duct tape used to bypass logical continuity, Jimmy rubs the artifact and casually wishes a Supergirl into existence. She manifests completely out of nowhere, blonde, enthusiastic, and wearing a pleated skirt variant of the corporate logo. Superman's immediate reaction in the panels is telling. He doesn't express joy at discovering he is no longer the sole survivor of his doomed species. He doesn't feel relief. He is visibly, profoundly stressed out. The man who casually wrestles rogue planets is suddenly threatened by the sheer administrative hassle of a competent female colleague. But she isn't really a colleague, she's a magical construct. This was a completely risk-free focus group. She has all the powers. She wears the branding, but she isn't real. If the core demographic of male readers had sent in a flood of angry letters complaining about a girl invading their boys' club, DC could just point to the totem and say she never existed. Continuity remained unpolluted. To make absolutely sure the core franchise wasn't overshadowed, the narrative deliberately positions her as a liability. She tries to assist Superman, but repeatedly gets in his way. Then, in a finale dripping with unintentional metaphor, she intercepts a fatal dose of kryptonite meant for Superman. As she lies dying, she asks Jimmy Olsen to use the totem to wish her out of existence, so she won't have to suffer. The prototype female hero's ultimate narrative function was to absorb damage meant for the male lead, apologize for the inconvenience, and voluntarily erase herself from the corporate payroll. It was the perfect crime. But a funny thing happened in the mailroom. The readers didn't riot, they cheered. The prototype was a massive, undeniable hit. The A/B test proved that a female demographic could be tapped without alienating the base. Suddenly, the executives realized that representation wasn't a threat to the brand, it was a highly exploitable new revenue stream. 9 months later, a very real rocket from Krypton would crash land on Earth, bringing Kara Zor-El with it. The focus group was over, it was time to manufacture the product. 2. In May 1959, the focus group phase officially ended, and the actual Kara Zor-El crash-landed on Earth in the pages of Action Comics number 252. And her backstory is, frankly, completely unhinged in its tragedy. While baby Kal-El got a clean, quick escape from Krypton's destruction, Kara actually had to live through it. Her hometown of Argo City survived the initial planetary explosion, encased in a dome, drifting through the frozen void of space for over a decade. But then, a rogue meteor shower pierced the dome, turning the very ground they walked on into lethal kryptonite. Kara had to watch her parents and everyone she ever knew slowly succumb to radiation poisoning before being shoved into a makeshift rocket and fired at a distant solar system. She arrives on Earth as a deeply traumatized refugee who has just witnessed a slow-motion, localized apocalypse. She steps out of the rocket possessing exactly the same god-like, reality-bending abilities as her famous cousin. And she is, chronologically speaking, older than him. So what is the very first thing the Man of Tomorrow does with his newly discovered, infinitely powerful, highly traumatized family member? He immediately goes into asset management mode. He shoves a frumpy, ill-fitting brown wig on her head, drives her to the suburbs and dumps her at the Midvale orphanage. He doesn't bring her to the Fortress of Solitude. He doesn't introduce her to his adoptive parents in Smallville. He gives her the civilian name Linda Lee and effectively places her in a witness protection program for the crime of being a superpowered teenage girl. Superman explicitly instructs her that she must remain an absolute secret. He claims this is for her own protection, or perhaps to serve as his secret weapon in an emergency, a justification that sounds remarkably like stashing an embarrassing relative in an off-book facility until you can figure out how to monetize them. The juxtaposition is staggering. Clark Kent operates out of a bustling metropolis, working a prestigious white-collar media job, keeping a bachelor pad, and regularly shaking hands with the President of the United States in broad daylight. Kara is given a strict curfew, a drab dress, and a broom. While Superman is out punching rogue asteroids and receiving literal keys to the city, Kara is instructed to keep her head down and meticulously use her microscopic heat vision to secretly sweep the orphanage floors without anyone noticing. She has the raw kinetic energy to shatter moons and reverse the spin of the planet, but her primary narrative function is doing stealth domestic labor. It is mid-century paternalism at its absolute finest. Both within the fiction of the story and the reality of the DC editorial office, the men in charge were terrified of what she represented. Superman couldn't risk sharing the spotlight, and the editors couldn't risk diluting their premium brand. So they built the ultimate superhero glass ceiling. They took a woman with the power of a god, handed her a mop, and told her to sit quietly in her room until she was granted permission to matter. 3. Welcome to the 1970s. The Bronze Age of comics. Outside the smoke-filled windows of DC's Manhattan offices, the world is undergoing a seismic cultural shift. Second-wave feminism is dominating the national conversation. Women are organizing for reproductive rights, marching for the Equal Rights Amendment, and fighting for the ability to open a simple checking account without a male relative's signature. Inside those offices, a room full of middle-aged men in short-sleeved button-downs are looking at their flagging sales figures and realizing that Kara Zor-El, their perpetual, dutiful teenager, needs to get with the times. They decide it is finally time for her to be liberated. The patriarchal chains of the Midvale orphanage are thrown off. She is allowed to age up, attend Stanhope College, and enter the workforce. She tries her hand at a few relatable, independent careers for an extraterrestrial demigod, a student counselor, a TV news camera operator, and eventually a starring role as a soap opera actress. But the true hallmark of Kara's 1970s emancipation wasn't her career trajectory, it was her wardrobe. The editorial board realized they had absolutely no idea what modern, liberated young women actually wore. So, in a stroke of cost-saving corporate synergy, they outsourced the problem. DC Comics launched a massive campaign, actively asking their readers to mail in their own designs for Supergirl's new look. What followed was a dizzying, chaotic era primarily contained within the pages of Adventure Comics. Kara was subjected to a relentless, issue-by-issue parade of reader-submitted fashion. She fought crime in hot pants, puffy pirate blouses, lace-up knee-high leather boots, and vaguely Grecian tunics. It wasn't just a costume change, it was a compulsion. She functioned less as a traditional superhero and more as a high-altitude paper doll, sometimes debuting multiple new outfits in a single-story arc. To the executives in charge, liberation was simply a rotating closet. They fundamentally confused giving a female character actual narrative autonomy with giving her a revolving runway of fashion choices. It is a perfect encapsulation of corporate co-optation. They took the aesthetics and the language of a genuine social movement and applied it exclusively to hemline measurements. The quiet irony, of course, was the demographic reality of these reader-submitted designs. The illusion of feminist independence was being crowdsourced by and perfectly synthesized for the maintenance of the male gaze. She was a modern, independent woman now, absolutely. She had a job, an apartment, and the undeniable hard-won freedom to wear a V-neck cut directly down to her navel while doing aerial combat with bank robbers. DC successfully updated her for the new decade, ensuring that her primary narrative function being looked at remained completely undisturbed. 4. By 1985, DC Comics was facing an existential threat, but it wasn't a cosmic supervillain. It was market share. Marvel was dominating the newsstands, and DC's 50-year accumulation of continuity had become an impenetrable barrier to entry for new consumers. There was Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, Earth's S, Earth X. If a kid walked into a drugstore with 75 cents, Figuring out which Superman they were supposed to be buying required a flowchart and a working knowledge of theoretical physics. The intellectual property had become completely top-heavy. So, the executives authorized the ultimate corporate restructuring, Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was a massive line-wide publishing event designed to collapse the multiverse into a single, highly marketable, streamlined continuity. But this consolidation came with a strict editorial mandate handed down from the publisher's office to restore the premium value of Superman. The brand required artificial scarcity. He had to be the singular, tragic, lonely god again. He had to be the sole survivor of Krypton. Kara Zor-El, by her very existence, was a structural redundancy. She diluted the core product. In the pages of Crisis on Infinite Earths number 7, the solution to this administrative problem is rendered with operatic grandeur. The Anti-Monitor, a cosmic entity of pure antimatter, is attempting to unmake reality itself. Superman is incapacitated, moments away from being destroyed. Kara charges in, unleashing power she didn't even know she had, shattering the villain's armor and saving her cousin's life. In retaliation, the Anti-Monitor blasts her with a lethal beam of energy. Superman holds her battered, lifeless body against the ruins of a dying universe, weeping. It is undeniably one of the most iconic, visually arresting sequences in comic book history. But pull the camera back from the page, through the ink, and into the boardroom. This wasn't a narrative necessity, it was a liquidation event. Kara wasn't killed by an antimatter beam, she was killed by a spreadsheet. The editorial team needed to streamline the product line. And when it came time to make the hard cuts, the easiest asset to discard was the female spin-off character. They gave her a spectacular death, patted themselves on the back for the emotional weight of it all, and then executed the final, most brutal phase of the layoff. When the crisis ended and the new universe was forged, Kara wasn't just dead. She was erased. She was written entirely out of continuity. Superman had no memory of her. The citizens of Earth had no memory of her. The orphanage, the hot pants, the soap opera career, all of it was deleted from the historical record as if it had never occurred. For nearly 20 years, DC maintained this total embargo. To ensure the Man of Steel's angst remained economically potent, the girl who had spent decades fighting alongside him was relegated to a non-entity. She died to save a universe that immediately forgot her name, simply because honoring her memory would have violated the new quarterly business strategy. 5. By 1988, the editorial department at DC Comics was quietly patting itself on the back for successfully purging Kara Zor-El from existence and restoring Superman's brand purity. But down the hall, the legal department was having a mild panic attack. In the United States, trademark law operates on a strict use it or lose it principle. If a publisher abandons a highly recognizable, legally protected title like Supergirl for too long, the trademark can expire. Worse, a rival publisher across town could legally swoop in, slap the name on their own character, and siphon off the market share, a maneuver Marvel Comics had already successfully executed with the name Captain Marvel. DC simply couldn't let that happen, but they were trapped by their own newly minted, heavily enforced corporate mandate. Superman must be the sole survivor of Krypton. So how do you publish a Supergirl comic without a Kryptonian girl? You rely on the finest tradition of corporate fiction, a convoluted loophole engineered specifically to satisfy a boardroom requirement. Enter Matrix. Matrix wasn't an alien refugee. She was, quite literally, a shape-shifting blob of sentient pink protoplasm. In the sprawling, panicked lore of the era, she was artificially engineered in a pocket universe by an alternate reality, benevolent version of Lex Luthor. This gelatinous entity was programmed with Superman's memories and subsequently chose to mold her pink goo into the shape of a conventionally attractive blonde teenager wearing a blue skirt and a red cape. This isn't just a character, this is a breathing, punching legal placeholder. Matrix is the physical manifestation of intellectual property law, poured into a familiar mold just to keep the copyright filing active at the US Patent and Trademark Office. She flew, she fought crime, but her primary narrative function was retaining the exclusive commercial rights to the prefix super, and because this was the dawn of the 1990s, an era defined by spectacular editorial miscalculations, the trajectory of the protoplasmic trademark gets infinitely weirder. Having crossed over into the mainline DC continuity, this naive synthetic lifeform needs a supporting cast. She ends up moving to Metropolis and entering into a highly publicized romantic relationship with a man named Lex Luthor II. Lex Luthor III was not the original villain's son. The original Lex Luthor had developed terminal cancer from wearing a radioactive kryptonite ring. To survive, he faked his own death in a plane crash, had his brain secretly transplanted into a younger, taller, fully cloned body, grew a thick red beard, and faked a heavy Australian accent to convince the global financial markets that he was his own long-lost heir. And the very first thing this 20-something clone body, carrying a middle-aged sociopath's brain, does is seduce the naive, shape-shifting blob that looks exactly like his arch-nemesis's dead cousin. He installs her as his personal bodyguard and living girlfriend. Nothing screams heroic legacy quite like a synthetic copyright extension making out with the genetic copy of a billionaire supervillain cosplaying as an Australian. The original Kara Zor-El was created to test a demographic. Matrix was created to maintain a monopoly. It is a beautiful testament to the industry. When forced to choose between narrative integrity and losing a trademark, a corporation will always choose the pink, shape-shifting goo. 6. By 1996, the American comic book industry was nursing a massive self-inflicted hangover. The great speculator boom of the early 90s had violently collapsed, leaving millions of unread holographic foil variant covers rotting in the backrooms of bankrupt strip mall comic shops. The publishers were terrified, and they were staring intensely at the remaining sales charts. What was actually moving units? Titles like Todd McFarlane's Spawn, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and Garth Ennis's Preacher. The market had spoken. The target demographic didn't want brightly colored paragons of justice anymore. They wanted demons, hellfire, and heavy brooding theological angst. Back at DC headquarters, editors looked at their Matrix Supergirl, a naive pink shape-shifting blob dating an Australian accented Lex Luthor clone, and realized she simply didn't fit the new paradigm. She wasn't marketable to a readership currently buying 9-inch nail CDs and discovering existential nihilism. She needed edge, and she needed it immediately. Enter writer Peter David, who was handed the seemingly impossible task of aggressively rebranding the copyright placeholder. The solution he and the editorial team landed on was as deeply rooted in mid-90s excess as a heavy metal wallet chain. The writers introduced a brand new human character, Linda Danvers. Linda was not a cheerful Kryptonian orphan sweeping floors. She was a deeply troubled teenager who had willfully gotten herself involved in a literal demonic cult. Her narrative formally begins when her cult leader boyfriend decides to brutally sacrifice her with a jagged dagger. Matrix, the protoplasmic Supergirl, attempts to intervene and save the dying girl's life. But because this is 1996, they don't just team up. They physically, biologically, and spiritually fuse together in a pool of blood. The resulting amalgamation completely severed Supergirl from her traditional science fiction roots and violently shoved her into a biblical apocalypse. She was no longer an alien or a science experiment. She was suddenly declared an earthborn angel of fire. She sprouted literal flaming wings from her back. Her traditional heat vision was replaced with the power of divine judgment. She spent her monthly issues fighting actual demons, wrestling with original sin, and engaging in heavy-handed debates about moral relativism. To be fair to the creative team, it was a genuinely fascinating, critically acclaimed run of comics. They took an absolute mess of a corporate mandate and spun it into compelling fiction. But zoom out and look at the structural reality of what happened. When Superman's sales dip, editors might temporarily change the length of his hair or the electrical composition of his suit, but he remains fundamentally himself. His core identity is heavily protected because the primary asset has undeniable historical value. But when the publisher needs to revamp the female spin-off, they feel completely comfortable obliterating her core identity to chase a localized trend. She isn't treated as a character with intrinsic foundational worth. She is a corporate R&D department. She is a sponge, perpetually forced to absorb whatever the prevailing pop culture aesthetic happens to be on any given Tuesday, just to keep her trademark active. In 1959, she was a dutiful domestic worker. In the 70s, she was a walking fashion catalogue. And in 1996, the only way the executives could justify her existence was by turning her into the superhero equivalent of a youth group pastor going through a severe goth phase. 7. After 19 years of the DC editorial board fiercely insisting that Superman's lonely god brand purity required absolute enforcement, someone looked at a quarterly revenue projection and decided the embargo was over. By 2004, the shape-shifting pink blob era had run its course. The flaming demon-hunting Earth Angel was cancelled. It was finally time to break the emergency glass and bring the original biological Kara Zor-El back into mainline continuity. You might expect a grand, emotional family reunion in the Fortress of Solitude, or a poignant reflection on surviving planetary genocide. Instead, her Kryptonian pod crashes into the murky depths of Gotham Harbor. And how does the most iconic female legacy character in the DC stable make her triumphant, long-awaited return to the page? She swims to the surface and emerges into the moonlight completely naked, her anatomy conveniently obscured by just enough shadow and splashing water to secure a standard newsstand rating. This was the Supergirl from Krypton arc in Superman, Batman #8, penciled by the late Michael Turner. Turner was an immensely talented and influential artist, but his signature aesthetic defined the absolute peak of early 2000s comic book excess. It was an era where every female character was visually engineered to look like an aggressively airbrushed magazine model. The wholesome 1950s floor-sweeping orphan was violently swapped for the prevailing cultural trend: raw, unchecked teenage hormones and impossible anatomical geometry. When she finally acquires a costume, it is a tiny, midriff-bearing crop top paired with a skirt that actively defies gravity and atmospheric drag. The narrative attempts to justify her aggressive new persona by leaning into her backstory. She is angry, confused, and suffering from severe PTSD because, unlike Superman, she actually remembers her homeworld burning. But the deep tragedy of her characterization is entirely eclipsed by the framing of the camera. The script tells you she is a traumatized 16-year-old refugee. The artwork tells you she is a centerfold. It is a masterclass in hypersexualization masquerading as female empowerment. She was given an attitude to make her seem independent, but her visual design was specifically optimized to ensure adolescent boys would buy the issue. And if you look at the actual plot of her own reintroduction story, her independence is a complete illusion. She possesses virtually no agency. She doesn't chart her own destiny. She is immediately treated as a volatile asset to be managed. Batman instantly suspects she's a trap and threatens her with Kryptonite. Superman literally locks her in his headquarters for her own safety, echoing the exact same patriarchal confinement of the 1950s orphanage. She is handed over to Wonder Woman for combat training, only to be promptly kidnapped by Darkseid, the fascist rock-faced god of apocalypse. Darkseid brainwashes her, dresses her in an even more revealing, spiked black leather outfit, and turns her into his personal assassin. For her grand rebirth, Kara Zor-El was reduced to a highly lucrative piece of contested property. She was fought over by Superman, Batman, and Darkseid, existing primarily as a plot device to move male characters to action and as a visual device to move units off the shelves. The prototype was finally back, but she was entirely owned by the new century's male gaze. 8. By 2015, the cultural landscape had shifted again. The era of the girl boss was in full swing, and multinational corporations had finally calculated that female empowerment was no longer a fringe political liability, but a highly lucrative, untapped demographic market. Enter the CW TV series. After 6 decades of being a cynical focus group, a mop-wielding domestic secret, a Bronze Age fashion doll, an apocalyptic flaming angel, and a heavily airbrushed centerfold, Kara Zor-El was finally granted permission to be the undisputed main character. She stepped entirely out of Clark's shadow, and on the surface, the checklist of progress is meticulously filled out. She eventually gets a practical suit with actual, functional pants. She is surrounded by a supportive sisterhood rather than just scowling male mentors. She even gets a high-powered media executive boss, Cat Grant, who reliably delivers weekly, heavily scored monologues about breaking the glass ceiling that sound like they were lifted directly from a Fortune 500 corporate diversity seminar. It is, without question, a massive, undeniable win for visibility. Millions of young girls finally got to turn on their televisions and see a hero who looked like them, leading a global franchise with unashamed optimism. But you have to look at the structural reality of the broadcasting machinery. This is perfectly, flawlessly sterilized empowerment. It is a cheerful, frictionless brand of primetime feminism, neatly packaged into heavily standardized 42-minute episodic chunks. The narrative is carefully constructed to ensure the revolution sits safely sandwiched between ad breaks for luxury sedans, prescription antidepressants, and fast food. The show frequently gestures toward massive, systemic issues: alien refugee crises, xenophobia, and the inherent dangers of unchecked corporate power. But because Supergirl was broadcast on a network jointly owned by two of the largest media conglomerates on the planet, the narrative solutions are not allowed to be actually disruptive. The structural decay of society is always conveniently reduced to the actions of a few rogue supervillains or corrupt tech billionaires. Once Kara punches the bad apple into a high-tech holding cell, the system goes right back to functioning normally. The underlying message isn't that the machine is fundamentally broken. The message is simply that the machine just needs a more compassionate, female manager. The radical historical edges of the feminist movement are meticulously sanded down so as not to agitate the shareholders or spook the advertisers. Kara Zor-El has finally achieved the absolute pinnacle of pop culture relevance. She has total narrative autonomy, a dedicated voice, and a massive global audience. But the ultimate price of admission to the corporate mainstream was becoming the safest, most easily digestible, non-threatening product imaginable. The revolution is televised. It conforms perfectly to the 18 to 34 target demographic metrics, and it is brought to you by the CW network.